welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this new FIIC and CICA webinar on infrastructure. It's a pleasure to have you again. Before starting, the technical discussion, just a few points. Please keep your microphone off during the presentations of our speakers. It will be greatly appreciated. If you have some questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or at the end of the webinar, you will be able to raise your hand and ask questions directly. Also, there is a Spanish and English translation in real time. So if you want, you can select your preferred language at the bottom of your screen, where there is an interpretation globe, and you can select English or Spanish as you prefer. This meeting is being recorded. It will be available on our platforms later during this week, and so you can go back to it and of course share it on your social media as well. And I'm pleased to introduce Fernando Lago. He's the chairman of our infrastructure working group at CICA. It has been a really supporter in the fact that to enhance the investment in infrastructure and fruitful dams. So I'm pleased to leave the floor to Fernando to give the opening and explain what we will be talking about today. Fernando, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for connecting today. As part of our joint activities between CICA, the World Confederation of Construction, and FIIC, the Inter-American Federation of Construction, the working group about long-term financing of infrastructure today presents this webinar about the assessment of the impact of infrastructure projects. We consider this an important factor because we think that the favorable impact of the construction work is usually underestimated. The sectors interested in this topic have been developing for decades different models to assess the impacts during the execution of the works, analyzing their effects in direct and indirect employment and induced employment as well, about the activity and value chains, and even so about tax collection derived from that direct and indirect activities. We understand that in general, the effects of the works are not assessed when the works are finished and operational. The project was executed because it provides more benefits than costs, but it does so throughout its entire useful life, improves sectorial productivity and the quality of life and safety of users. The resulting effects or the externalities that the operation of an asset generates or enables in other productive sectors, as well as in the overall regional or national economy, can be very significant. Today, we will hear two presentations that show how econometric tools allow us to measure such effects. We will see applications of these social accounting matrices and an evolution of input-output matrices, estimated at the national or regional level. The usefulness of these tools is increased by improvements in matrix calculation processes, which are reaching new and enormous capabilities. We will then welcome Aiga Stockenberger, Senior Transport Economist at the World Bank, and Alfredo Mainar from the University of Seville in Spain. Andin will introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, for these few words. So I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Aiga Stockenberger, Senior Transport Economist at the World Bank. She works in Latin America and the Caribbean region, where she leads investment and development policy lending operations focused on urban mobility and regional economic corridors. Before joining the Transport Global Practice, Aiga worked on electricity regulation and governance, energy policy, and trade and logistics at institutions including the World Resources Institute and the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. She holds a master's degree in international energy policy and International Economics from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a PhD in Urban Economics and Land Use from Stanford University. So I think we are in good hands for this first presentation. So Aiga, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I will share my slides briefly. Please let me know if you can see them.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this morning I will be speaking in English. It's just slightly easier for me, but my slides are in Spanish. I hope that will be fine for everyone. I will be presenting work that is we recently completed about a year ago in the World Bank that was focused on identifying infrastructure investment and policy priorities for the Norte Grande region of Argentina, which includes 10 provinces shown here in the map. And since then, this analytical work has informed a large multi-phase investment lending program, actually, in several of these provinces. And I can mention some of that at the end. But the idea is to focus on the part of this study that really deploy different types of tools to try to understand what are the different economic impacts of infrastructure investment. And I will specifically focus on the road investments, even though the report also covered some other types of infrastructure. So the agenda for today, first I will talk a little bit about kind of a general framework for how do we think about infrastructure investment impacts. The second, and then I will delve deeper into the actual report, starting with, a very brief overview of the multi-criteria analysis that was conducted to actually select the investments, the priority investments, and then different types of tools that we used, existing tools and also new tools that help estimate the expected impacts. I should say that this is not an ex-post impact evaluation. It's a forward-looking study to inform World Bank lending. So firstly, just a little bit about this kind of broader framework for how to think about infrastructure investments. So the slide shows sort of the theory of change, linking the infrastructure investments, which are aimed at reducing connectivity frictions and bottlenecks. That is expected to lead to sort of the direct impacts, which are reductions in transport cost, transport time, and improvements in transport reliability. That then leads to intermediate economic impacts, things like investment, trade, agglomeration, productivity, employment, and structural change. And then finally, the things that we really care about are the wider economic benefits, such as economic welfare, improved sustainability, and equality. And of course, there are many trade-offs when we invest in a corridor. There will be trade-offs and synergies between different types of impacts. Depending on, for example, if the regions in where the investments are made are producing tradable goods or non-tradable goods, there will definitely be variations in these impacts across space, depending on the economic structure. And then just a little bit of kind of a little parenthesis here, specifically focusing on employment impacts. This is a very big priority right now for the World Bank Group. Almost every project, every country strategy is framed with the goal of generating jobs. I don't know if you might be familiar with this, but in the last few months, a new strategy was developed in the World Bank to really focus on how different sectors and investments and policies can contribute to job generation. And there has also been a lot of work ongoing on developing methodologies to actually estimate not only the short-term job impacts, which are sort of the ones that we can estimate using input-output models, but also look at more sort of better long-term jobs that can be created in the broader economy through these infrastructure investments. And so I will, this is just to say this is kind of a priority for the World Bank, and there is, in the coming months, I think we will see more methodologies coming out formally that help estimate these broader impacts, not only in immediate job impacts. Just a bit of a kind of a context. So Norte Grande is as I mentioned, it's the 10 northern provinces, as you all know, probably. And part of what the report does is firstly characterize the economic geography of the region in terms of its role in agricultural trade, production in Argentina, for example. It produces 90% of sugar. It produces all of the lithium exports that are coming out of Argentina. There are other critical minerals that are being developed, like copper. In the province where I am now developing an investment loan, which is the province of Salta, copper is actually the one that's expected to generate by far the biggest volumes of cargo. So the first thing the report does is does a very detailed mapping of the economic geography and projections for the region. And then how does that translate onto the transport network needs? So the maps on the right show the projections for increase in the lithium mining cargo, but also specifically lithium cargo flows on the road network in the three northwestern provinces of Argentina, which are Catamarca, Salta, and Jujuy. And we obviously this is an important insight when you try to estimate what should be the infrastructure investment priorities and also the expected economic impacts. And then just as another kind of comment here, there's relatively good data on the condition of the national network in Argentina, but this is not the case for the provincial roads. So part of what this report did was also leverage satellite imagery and AI tools to estimate in detail the condition of the provincial network and partly to identify where should the investments focus. And as you can see in these maps and the graphs, the vast majority of provincial network in Norte Grande is in poor condition. And we have other work in this report that also looks at climate vulnerability, including of the tertiary network, just to have a complete picture of the needs, and then later to quantify the expected impacts of improving those roads. So now entering a little bit more into the multi-criteria analysis that we used, the Consejo Federal de Inversión, they've been working with provinces for a long time to identify sort of the priorities across different transport assets, roads, rail, logistics, ports. And so what we did was not to start identifying priorities from scratch. We took an existing, large piece of work that FIIC did over several years that was completed in 2022, which identified a lot of, a long list of potential priorities in the region. And we applied a multi-criteria analysis to really distill, 15 to 20 roads and rail links that would be the most impactful. And these are the criteria that were used to actually develop this short list. So it's divided sort of in four broad categories. One is local economic importance, as measured by, for example, the freight flows, the population that lives along these segments, poverty levels. Then looking at interregional connectivity of these, what role these segments play in interregional connectivity, based on surveys that we did with producers in different value chains in Norte Grande, largest sugar producers, grain aggregators. So this report includes also that type of analytical work, on which we worked with CIPEC, to try to identify, try to put numbers on this multi-criteria analysis. And then we looked at things like institutional complexity for implementing these works, whether financing or budget was already assigned to any of these projects. And then another important priority is what role these investments could play for climate change mitigation, which is more in the case of rail, or how vulnerable are these segments to climate risks. And this was another criteria for identifying priorities. And so in the case of the road segments, we defined 15 priority roads based on this multi-criteria analysis. as you can see, they are basically in every province of Norte Grande. The largest number of roads that we identified as priority are in Salta and Tucumán. They include different types of road projects or road works that would be required, including, for example, bypass lanes, rehabilitation, paving, expansion of the lanes, and these segments are varying in length from 2 kilometers. In some cases, I think there were some in Tucumán that are kind of very strategic segments, but they are very short, all the way up to 576-kilometer long segment. And the traffic, the daily traffic on these segments is also varies very widely, which ultimately impacts also the economic impact that these investments would have. So the daily traffic ranges from below 300 vehicles per day to nearly 3,000. And what is important is also that 8 out of 15 of these priority segments, they actually cross several provincial boundaries, which is important for when we think of coordinated investments across provincial borders, especially now in the context where provinces are taking more of the responsibility for infrastructure investments. And then now just quickly on the actual impacts that we evaluated. So as I mentioned, first we looked at the immediate impacts, which are the transport costs for operators. And here we used an updated model that already exists in Argentina, the MCC. Later we looked at the direct, indirect, and induced impact, employment impacts. And for that, we used an input-output model that was there was a detailed report already prepared in 2021 with World Bank support, and we used those models and updated them with some additional types of projects to be able to apply to these 15 road projects. And then what I mentioned in the introductory slide, which was this long-term better jobs, which are beyond the short-term jobs that are directly created as part of the civil works. For that one, we used a new methodology that the World Bank is finalizing right now, which basically looks at the existing infrastructure, road infrastructure stock in the country and labor elasticities vis-a-vis investment in road infrastructure stock to estimate how many long-term jobs would be created. And then looking at more intermediate economic and wider economic benefits, such as productivity improvements and GDP impacts at the regional or national level, we worked with the University of Buenos Aires, the economics department, to develop spatial general equilibrium models. And those ones, we were able to only develop for 5 of the 10 provinces. Although, of course, if there was a World Bank project in any of the other 5, we would probably focus on developing new models for those ones. And then specifically looking at some of the results. So looking at the direct impacts on the transport costs for operators. In these maps, you can show 2 different presentations of these impacts. So on the map on the left, it's in terms of percentage reduction. And you can see that, these impacts are quite different depending on the segment. So for example, the segment that crosses Formosa, the reductions would be between 4% and 8% of the operating costs, while for some other segments, such as in, I think this is between Jujuy and Salta, or a segment in the south, the savings would be up to over 20%. And then on the right-hand side, this is where the actual traffic, the cargo volumes become important. This is measuring the savings that would be in absolute terms, considering the traffic that travels on these corridors. And here you can see that again it's a very wide range, but for some of the most critical segments, most strategic segments for the region, such as the National Road 34. And National Road 9 in Northwest Argentina, the savings would be over $50 million per year in 2024 dollars. And I should say that also for some of these investments, I think that if we did the analysis now, the estimates would be even higher because, for example, for National Road 51 in Salta, the analysis that we did was based on traffic flows in 2022 or 2023, which do not yet consider, the expansion of lithium, expansion of copper, all the traffic that is expected to grow exponentially on those roads. So I think that if this analysis was updated now, or let's say in the coming couple of years, these numbers would be much more impressive. And this is just a quick note that, as I said, there's a wide range in terms of these impacts, even for the same amount of investment needed. You can see in this graph that for roughly the same amount of investment in the expected cost savings are very different. For example, between this road in whereas Corrientes, the impacts are much lower for this roughly the same amount of investment compared to, a very strategic road that connects, I think this is in Tucumán. So this is just a visual reminder that, the bang for the buck is going to be very different depending on how strategic that road is. And then quickly on the employment impacts, like I mentioned, there are two different types of employment impacts that we looked at. One is the classic short-term, let's say short-term, meaning during the project implementation of 4 or 5 years, where we applied the input-output matrices, and we calculated that across all of these 15 priority investments, around 41,000 jobs would be created, among which 47% would be direct, 30% indirect, and 23% induced. And then you can see here on the graph on the right side, kind of the diversity across these projects. So the largest number of jobs are expected to be created in the case of National Route 9 and National Route 51. But for some others, these job impacts would be much smaller. And then applying this methodology that I mentioned that relies on the infrastructure stock and labor elasticity for Argentina, we estimate that across all these investments, nearly 20,000 long-term jobs would be created in the wider economy. This is something that is not in the report itself. This is something now that we estimated as part of preparing the investment project in Salta. And then in terms of the wider economic benefits, which, we look at the GDP impacts for the provinces that are actually crossed by the segments, and then for the wider economy of Argentina, you can see that the impacts are very, very wide range again. For National Route 34, we estimate over $4 billion of GDP impacts, whereas for some other ones, it's a much smaller number. And we look at the value addition per sector that would be created through these investments, and we find that the agriculture sector would benefit the most. Although, like I said before, this analysis is based on 2022, 2023 traffic flows, which don't yet consider the expansion of the mining sector, which is happening as we speak. Another kind of interesting finding is that, there are a lot of spillover effects of these investments across the borders. It's not necessarily that the province where the investments will be made is the one that's going to capture most of the benefits. You can see here in these graphs on the top that, for example, in the case of National Road 34, which is in Salta and Jujuy, 15% of the total GDP benefits of that investment would be captured by those two provinces, but the rest would be captured by the rest of Argentina. And in the case of National Route 51, this percentage captured by Salta, which is the province that actually is crossed by the segment, is even lower. Most of the GDP benefits would actually be captured by the rest of the country. And then this is a very brief kind of just summary of the different impacts that we calculated, just to give a sense of how, it's not necessarily that across all the different impacts, the projects will, have or be ranked similarly. So, for example, in the case of National Road 34, it has the largest transport cost savings in terms of absolute savings and the largest GDP impact, but not necessarily the largest employment generation impact. So you can see kind of if you apply different lenses of economic impact, you might see a different order of the projects will be ordered in a different way. And this is just a reminder that, the more tools we use to estimate impacts, the more complete the understanding will be of the trade-offs. I'll stop here. I think I'm already way over time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aiga. It was really interesting. And if that's okay, there is just one question in the chat, so I think we can take it now. So it's the question if you used HDM4 or HDM5 to identify these priority roads.
Not in the stage of prioritizing. I mean, we needed a tool that would be more comprehensive than HDM4, let's say. HDM4 really focuses on the immediate, transport cost saving impacts, which is just one subset of what we looked at in the multi-criteria analysis. The point of the analysis was to look at other things like, the intra-regional strategic importance of this road or climate, like I mentioned, all these different criteria that entered. But that being said, now that we are actually using this report's findings to inform investment lending. So we have a project with the province of Salta and another one that's going to be with the province of Jujuy. At this stage, of course, we applied HDM4 to actually do the core economic analysis for the project. Now that we know which segment we are going to improve, we used HDM4 to estimate the economic analysis.
Thank you, Aiga. Very clear. So now we'll go to Alfredo and we'll see if other questions pop up for you at the end of the webinar. So now I'm pleased to introduce Alfredo Maynard, Associate Professor at the University of Seville. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Zaragoza and specializes in multi-sectoral, linear, and computable general equilibrium models, which are widely used to analyze economic impacts across sectors and regions. Alfredo also served as project officer at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Currently, he works as an expert consultant for organizations including the World Bank and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. His research focuses on impact analysis, regional development, environmental economics, including several studies related to the tourism sector. So please, Alfredo, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Andine.
Thank you very much, Andine. Thank you for inviting me for this webinar. I will do, opposed to Aiga, my slide will be in English and I will speak in Spanish so that we complement each other and supplement each other. Aiga's presentation has been very interesting and she used part of what we will see here. The general models that I will speak about, that I will talk about, need these databases, these social accounting matrices. So the idea is to present here what are these types of investments, what do they contribute, and how do they contribute to analyze their potential. I will wrap up with a very brief example for the Spanish economy, a very coarse example, so that we can analyze the potential of the tool. The first thing that I would like to say is that maybe we're all familiar with this, that the input-output model is a crucial tool for the analysis of any economy, analyzing the impact in a region, in a country. It's a tool with a great capability because of its intuition and its analytical capabilities. When we select, and I will choose why we do this, because the social accounting matrix, because when we choose an input-output framework, we have the traditional input-output framework, a symmetrical transaction matrix, where you have the value added and the final demand, We can analyze the impacts and so forth. Or we have an integrated outline of the IO framework with the supply and use tables. Even if they are less intuitive for newcomers, they are way more explanatory for other models. Why? Because we are separating activities and production from the goods. And also, they are much more flexible when we want to work with real statistics. They are, the basic ones are a construction based on statistical information. So this is good, it gives us a lot of information, it gives us the indicators of impact and so forth, but there is a problem. We don't have all of the data from the economy, the feedback comes to the agents that do the final demand and how that final demand feedbacks into the system. So what we are doing here is losing that component. And that's why when we do an IO matrix, you get results and you get a direct effect and an indirect effect. But of course, we need to see from that indirect effect what is that directly indirect effect, so to say, and the induced effect. Those endless cycles of the circular flows. That's why we need to build a social accounting matrix. It's emerged in the 40s with the work from Stone. We have a lot of publications about it, so this one is one that can be useful for you. The social accounting matrix or SAM concept is defined. Well, what is this? Is to get the traditional input-output models and endogenize it more and more, to close it, let's say, but not only as a satellite or with annexes. It's going beyond this and completely closing this. What do I mean by closing it? Well, this circular flow of profit has to be closed as this closed matrix that you can see. That's the key, the core of what the input-output model contributes. Why do we do all this? Because of that final matrix that will provide that circular flow that we see here. The IO model tells you since activities pull the goods and how the goods get included in the productive process and how that production is, and that adds more value. That's what leads us to do this SAM. We need to close that gap. We need to close that using a lot of statistical data, as we will see, statistical data that will be applied to estimate the fluxes between added value, agents, and so forth. That is a social accounting matrix with all that it implies. This will open a double game. It will be, well, it will be useful in three ways. It will analyze the economy, allows us to analyze the economy, to do a linear analysis that is intuitive and serious analysis about the impacts and possible measures and possible exogenous factors such as demand and offer, because this is an analytical field that is very powerful, but also on the basis of what will be later on applied for more sophisticated studies, so to say. Obviously, the problems dealt with through a general model or a traditional model have more flexibility. We have seen the effect of an infrastructure projects, for instance, to see how this infrastructure, this bridge, this road improves productivity or improves the economic options of a country. The social accounting matrix cuts it. It restricts the linear model, so to say, but the general model needs that matrix to balance and calibrate and operate. Therefore, that triple function of the social accounting matrix, when we work with them, we find all of the problems that of an input-output matrix. We have the natural passing to a general model and fixed prices, the use of coefficients and fixed prices. That is crucial, of course. And a social accounting matrix, what is it? It's based on an input-output model, but what is it? Basically, I will first show you this, and then I'll show you the detail. This matrix, you can see on the screen, sorry, up to here, more or less, until the factors column, it's the input-output model, supply, use. Up to here, you have commodities, margins, activities, intermediary factors, taxes, and then we have, this would be more or less the destination matrix. We would have the part of the origin matrix here, and then here we have imports, products, margins, but all of this is the closed matrix. That's what we need to add to the input-output matrix to have the circular flow. We have activities and commodities separated at merge as homogeneous branches. As we said, separated by input-output or use and destination, or more homogeneous in a traditional I/O matrix. Production factors, private institutions, corporations, companies, separating the juridical form from the activity per se that is crucial, government accounts, combined capital accounts, and the accounts of the rest of the world. This is a matrix. These are the large numbers, right? But something that I want to clarify that is very important. What you have in front of you, this is a social accounting matrix and a closed matrix. You have added value, but it's not what we want yet. Why is it not what we want? Because the potential of this model is that these accounts of households, companies, government, or productive factors can be disaggregated and can reflect the composition of the society. A traditional I/O model to be able to analyze changes in poverty or income, well, you need to add something additional. You need to have additional accounts and to have the results from an I/O model and take them later on to a household model and have a new estimate. Nonetheless, if the social accounting matrix is done as it should be, disaggregating per region, per income, or any other factor, this circuit has gathered all of this. We know how this household uses their income, and this gives us a lot of information. It allows us to go way beyond this, beyond the general model that is based in all this. With the work factor, is the same. It will be disaggregated due to its capability, its skilled, semi-skilled degrees of capabilities. In the I/O model, you have that this activity pays a certain factor. How did the economy go? Well, we don't know because we don't know the factors. This has repercussions in input, investments. This is not by disaggregating households and income. This is very useful, but it's not the same. What should we do with a social accounting matrix? Well, we have to have the macro SAM. I'm sorry, I skipped one slide. We need to get all the cells and obtain the totals for each cells. The national matrix of the economy, you have the GDP, disaggregated GDP, the factors taxes, intermediate consumption, demand, all of these factors need to be expressed here. And then the table will provide the first values. That's the macro SIM. And then when we have that, we go into the goal of the study, what we want to do, what do we want to estimate, where do we want to reach, what do we want to reach? Well, we have a gross impact. We can use the macro SIM. These are national accounts, origin and destination, such as IO models. When you have the macro SIM, you go into the origin and destination tables, and you can get the disaggregated figures. With this, we can do an infinity of things. We can have an analysis of gross effects in different areas. But what do we want to know also? We want to know how a certain infrastructure or a certain economic policy transfers done by the government affects poverty, affects salaries, affects other things. Well, we need then to disaggregate. We need to disaggregate, and that is the goal. We need to add an infinity of data. We want to know microdata, household incomes. We have surveys, household surveys, and with that to compose our disaggregation. That is the crucial part. If we want to have a good SIM that is useful, we need to go with all the data and to create ourselves, as it is necessary, the disaggregation of data. That is crucial. So what do we need? Surveys, censuses, statistical data from public administration, tax data, statistics, a combination of things. And what do we see here? Well, this is something done very manually. Each country, each region, each area is a world in terms of data, in terms of infrastructure, and each region with their world vision to produce data. So that's where this complicated task comes in. How can we add all this data to the matrix? Basically, I will show briefly an SAM. Let's see. This precisely is the one of Spain for 2022 that I will use for this example, so that you can have an idea of how this is in practice. Look at this, it's disaggregated. I have disaggregated values and so forth, but you can see that you have all the income flows, sectors, etc. That's a bit the idea of having everything here together.
Once we have the matrix, that looks good. We have the economic data, but we have to analyze the impact. As I said before, we need to go from the most sophisticated model to the most general model, the linear SAM model. You know, it has all its capacity to see things that entail changes in productivity, elasticity. We need this, a linear SAM model. That's the long term what we need. But in the short term, we can use this model. That short-term model gives us a snapshot of what's happening, and that's what we can get via this model, the traditional model. We have the reversing here or the backward effect here. We do the sum of a column, and we have a backward or diffusion effect here. If we add rows, that's not academically pleasing, but we can see that there is an effect of impulse or absorption. And once we have this reverse matrix, that model can be extended or translated into whatever we want. I hope you understand what I'm saying. We can consider employment, or if we include a vector of emissions per output, added value per output, or whatever per output, then we will have an extension of those impact multipliers to any variable or economic sphere, which is extremely powerful. You know, you get a great first impact of that structure within the economic sphere. Everything that I've explained before is summarized in this document. You can just look it up and read it. This is a report that was prepared in 2018. This is available in the Office of the European Union repository. And let's move on to an example. This is a macro sum for Spain in 2023, okay? The grade areas are, or the grade values are the officials' values, and in red we have the values that need to be estimated. Those are the values that need to be estimated in red. This tiny macro sum summarizes rent flow in the Spanish economy. If you add up all the totals of work, capital, and taxes, we get the GDP for that year. You can analyze this by production, by demand, but we have the values of imports, exports, and this is the economy reflected on this chart. What we saw before in the Excel file, that's a product of this. Once we have this, we can analyze the impact. What I've done is a very simple exercise to show you the potential and so that you can see this tool at work. Of course, these are sometimes over-dimensioned results, but it is useful when you're working on public policies to show the potential and the benefit and cost ratio. You can use this to tell someone, well, this investment will create this impact. For example, in this example, these are the effects generated by a 1 million euro investment in infrastructure in Spain that will lead to the creation of 17.5 full-time equivalent jobs, an increase in the gross value added of 1.12 million euros, and an income household increase of 0.85 million euros. So, infrastructure investments and work is very relevant because what's also important is what comes after that investment. And maybe these models, these simple models, still need to contemplate this, okay? Now what we have to consider is the work and its repercussion. And something very important that I would like to point out, as Fernando said during his introduction, is that there is a direct induced impact, but also there is an impact that goes beyond the sector or the industry. Here we have split or broken down the impact between the construction sector and the rest of the economy. In terms of full-time equivalent jobs, we said that we created 17.5 full-time job equivalents. But look, half of it is for construction, and the rest, more than half, is the rest of the economy. So, the impacts go beyond your work and your industry. So, if we leave the future positive effects aside, that investment per se is creating a bigger impact in the rest of the economy rather than in its own construction sector. Let's give you an example. If we take data from the Public Works Ministry in Spain, we see that, and of course these are figures that may change, as you may know, of course, but the 8.5 million euros is approximately the cost, and this will create 150 full-time equivalent jobs, a gross value added of 10 million euros, and 7 million euros of household income. That's for 1 new kilometer of motorway. But if we're considering gigantic works like a large 3.5 kilometer viaduct over the Guadalquivir River, well, that is a very costly work because of the difficulty in the terrain and so on. And you're talking about 500 million euros. And it will create over almost 9,000 full-time equivalent jobs, over 560 millions of euros in gross value added, and 423 household income. Of course, these are very rough estimates, right? This is just an example for this presentation, okay? We could, of course, refine it a lot. We should also consider that, as the third item says, that if you carry out a work for a specific time frame, well, of course, the effects are spread out. If you're investing 500 million euros in 10 years, well, you have to spread that out over the 10 years to avoid misinterpretation. And we also have to consider that you're suggesting or supposing here that this is a public investment, but it may not be. It may very well not be. You can see things like this and say, okay, we're going to create viaducts all over the world. But the problem is that whenever you're investing money in this industry, you're not investing it in some other area. Perhaps you're doing a new viaduct, but you're not building a new hospital. So we would have to take this into consideration and analyze the cost-benefit ratio. Well, I would like to say that these figures help us see the potential of this activity, of this industry. Of course, it's overdimensioned, yes. But when it comes to wondering whether to carry out a piece of work or not, well, this might help us decide whether it's worth it to invest in the infrastructure or not, and whether the extra benefits that will happen after our work is done. This is the end of my presentation. Should you have any doubts, any concerns, that's my email. You can get in touch with me. I work in Universidad de Sevilla, SHAO, Sevilla University. And of course, you can text me, send me an email, and I'll gladly assist you. I think I've stuck to my time frame. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. It was really interesting and you're right on time. So do we have any reactions or questions from the audience? You can raise your hand, open your mic, or you can put them in the chat as you prefer.
Yo voy a romper el
I
hielo.
will break the ice. What is the quality and quantity of statistical information that is necessary in order to create a social accounting matrix that is reasonable? The national accounts according to the typical, are the national accounts according to the typical schemes enough, or do you need something else? Well, I've estimated these matrices for European countries, African countries, and each has its own data. The clear baseline is to have the national accounts. That's essential. If we don't have an input-output chart then or table, then well, we're going to have problems because those are associated to the table's publication years. If you have a table from 2022, you can work on a 2024 matrix, but you cannot use a 2010 table and try to do something in 2024. We need to know whether those tables are available. There was a case with an Ethiopian database that was non-existent, and we had to build that up. That was a huge effort together with our Ethiopian team. But then we also need integrated accounts. If you have an integrated account system, well, pretty much most of your job is already done because you have all the institutional factors, the households, companies, industries are all there with their own accounts. If you don't, well, there are estimation techniques, and matrix calculation techniques that you can use. But what are the necessary data? Well, surveys. Surveys in terms of household income and job creation. If you have a good matrix with significant household groups with considerable information in terms of poverty, labor, or the job creation for specific collective groups, well, you need that. Then you need an input-output table, national accounts, and other calculations, other household calculations that are also necessary. We have a question from Vincent. Andine, is that so?
Yes, thank you very much for this two very, very interesting presentation. I am working from my side to, I would say, more or less the same kind of topic, but not globally for a region, just only for projects I've tried to develop, and Fernando knows this very well, kind of model that I call the global global model for project assessment by opposition of the PFRAM from World Bank and IMF, which doesn't take into account the benefits, the long-term benefits of a project. Well, so I'm very, very happy to have heard two presentations on the same topics. I have a specific question about the fact that if the public funds are allocated to one project, they are not free for another one. There's a way to take this into account, which is to use the opportunity cost of public funds. Alfredo, did you use this approach, or what's your opinion about that?
No, it's okay. No, as I said, it's a key point, because as I present, you have great benefit for.
Sorry, there's a great benefit of the infrastructure equation, right? So the work should be completed, but you need to know where the money is coming from. That's essential. That analysis that you mentioned, well, it does entail seeing how the project will be funded. The funding model will be essential when it comes to seeing whether the project is going to be fruitful, whether the money and the benefit is coming from other funds that is going to create larger damages. Well, then the cost benefit ratio there is something that should be considered, particularly when it comes to these kind of infrastructures. That's why I say that the first purpose of this model, generally speaking, is to look at the capacity or capability and to be able to define the options. And when you have good options, well, you need to see the least damaging investment method. A great infrastructure is done because it's necessary. It's not something that is randomly desired. If it's necessary, it will create benefits that need to be considered. But once we see that, we may apply that same analysis to see where it's less damaging in terms of funding. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Yes, you have clarified things. And I have another question. You know very well that according to the type of contracts, you have not the same socioeconomic benefits. So did you look at the type of contract, I say, for instance, concession or PPPs versus traditional procurement?
No. No,
No, that can be done. That can be done. But once you have the tool, we can see how the impact comes about. The idea is on the matrix, on the model that we have, we apply different aspects, and we can apply variations, we can see the types of contract and how the cost of the works will be distributed according to the contract. It has not been done here, but it is possible to do it. We have done similar things in some cases in public infrastructure works in Africa. We saw as per how the work would be done, if it's a concession, direct payments, we'll analyze the different effects, yes. Well, if IGA can hear us, I would like maybe selfishly ask something, that is, what is the possibility to develop a model with computed balance for Argentina or an Argentine province?
Well, I think I think there's somebody connected, or I saw previously, who worked directly on this. I don't see her anymore, but Priscila Ramos from UVA is one of the professors that worked on this general equilibrium model for the World Bank report. So there's a group of economists in UVA that are very familiar with this, and they assessed the existing matrices that exist for Norte Grande, and found that only 5 of the 10 had sufficient background there that we could build on. But we did not consider, what we did was to focus in on the specific provinces of the Norte Grande, and then sort of rest of Argentina is it's the rest, we don't disaggregate by the other provinces in Argentina. That was not the purpose of this report. But I think it's a question for them, who know inside and out the matrices available for Argentina. There are three economists who worked on this from UBA that I can put you in touch with. But I saw Priscila was connected earlier in the presentation too.
We are in touch with them, thank you, so that we can progress with this topic. The question was more oriented to whether we could get to know the expectations of the World Bank about the possibilities of success of this project.
No, I mean, from our perspective, it's not a priority in the sense that, unless we have a investment project focusing on another province. Actually, we did consider, so right now the World Bank is implementing a multi-phase approach program in 4 provinces of Argentina. 2 of them are in the Norte Grande, and 2 of them are actually in Patagonia. And so there was a discussion of whether we could do similar work focusing on the Patagonia provinces, for example, but from our perspective, it's more the operational needs that would drive this kind of additional analytical work. Although there are other sectors in the World Bank, like the macro fiscal sector and trade sector, that might be working on this separately. I'm not aware.
Could you please expand a bit more on the concept on how you calculate long-term employment?
Yeah, so
based on the infrastructure stock, on roadway infrastructure stock.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not directly part of that team. It's done by the global unit of transport at the World Bank, but it's the idea is basically to come up with, in the World Bank projects, we have to measure what are called kind of corporate scorecard indicators. There's the idea that at least in every project, there will be at least 1 indicator or 2 indicators that are the same ones across every project, so that the World Bank can aggregate up across the entire infrastructure portfolio and say, for example, how many people we provided with access to resilient roads, So they're a little bit generic the way that they are defined, partly because they have to apply to every project, right? And so in this case of the employment, because employment is now, jobs is kind of the northern star now for everything that we do at the World Bank. And the chief economist office for infrastructure in the World Bank, Stefan Straub, is the chief economist. They've been trying to develop a methodology that could apply to every road project, right? So by definition, it is a little bit generic. It's purely based on the total infrastructure stock, the total road infrastructure stock in the country, the amount of investment that the project is going to invest in additional road infrastructure, and then the labor income elasticity vis-a-vis the road infrastructure, which is estimated for the whole Argentina. So by definition, this is a little bit generic. And for example, in the case of Salta, which I am working on on an investment project, we know that the road that we are improving is very strategic for the economy. It connects critical minerals areas to logistics facilities and further to the rest of Argentina. But this methodology is agnostic to the specific location of that road. It's purely using the elasticities and the total infrastructure stock in the country, because it's meant to apply to every road project in Argentina. And so I think this is sort of a first attempt at coming up with some kind of indicator that every project can use. But of course, I think in our case in Salta, this is an underestimate of the actual long-term jobs that would be created, because it doesn't consider the fact that this road is next to a very strategic, rapidly expanding economic sector.
Well, we are doing overtime and making good use of the kindness of our speakers and our audience. I don't know if anyone has another comment. It has been quite interesting. As Andine said, the recordings of this meeting will be available in each of the languages in a few days. So if we don't have further comments or questions, I wanted to thank you all. Thank the speakers for the presentations and the audience for their interest. Let's hope that we can have more events of this type soon. Andine?
Thank you very much, Aiga. Thank you very much, Alfredo. It was really interesting to learn about your works. We can stay in contact and, of course, organize other meetings if you have any more studies to come. Fernando, thank you very much for hosting and organizing this webinar. And I hope to see you all soon for another meeting, and have all the good day or good, afternoon.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Gracias.